Greetings, Culture Warriors. This is Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this latest dispatch from the front. I'm going to pitch a change up to you today. You know, I've talked a lot, given the crisis that we have in the United States of America and really in the wider world, represented by this pandemic and the social unrest that has followed. I've talked a lot about American values, gone into some detail in some cases, but, you know, basically have indicated my preference for a return to those classic American values that we seem to have gotten away from, especially since this pandemic has started. And so this being the podcast slated for the 4th of July, which in the United States of America is the celebration of our Independence Day. This is when we declared our independence as a nation from Great Britain, the greatest imperial power of its day. And so I thought what we would do today is to read together that Declaration of Independence and reflect a little bit on what it says about the values that we held at the very beginning of our nationhood. So if you bear with me, I know the language is a little bit older, a little bit more florid than we're used to, but I think we can bridge the gap together here. Declaration of Independence in Congress, July 4th, 1776. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So what does that say about American values right off the bat in that lead paragraph written by Thomas Jefferson here? It becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. It implies that people have a right to choose who govern them. Right? That contrary to the widely held belief of the time, as a justification for absolute monarchy, that the powers of the monarch over a people came from God, and that the people's place in the great chain of being, as it was called, was to obey. This value comes more from Enlightenment thinking, which holds that people have a right to choose who will lead them. To assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. What does that mean? It means that rights come from God, from the Creator, and that men are equal in the eyes of that Creator. And then the rest of the paragraph basically says, look, we owe the world an explanation for why we're seeking this severing of a relationship with those who have hitherto been our rulers. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate the government's long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government, and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So there's a lot of values language in that second paragraph. The notion that it's self-evident that all men are created equal, that we have unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As an interesting aside, in one of the original drafts for it was life, liberty, and property. And there was some great debate going back and forth before they settled on the pursuit of happiness, since not everyone owns property, but they felt that property was such an essential element of that pursuit of happiness that it very nearly was worded differently. The whole point of government is to secure those rights for the people. This is the concept of ordered liberty, something that Edmund Burke, the great English parliamentarian and figure of the Enlightenment, certainly could understand. Indeed, it's why Edmund Burke supported the American Revolution and opposed the French Revolution. That when a government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it. That means the government must be accountable to the people. This is a radical notion. Ever since the Sun King, Louis XIV, had ascended the throne in France a century before, and really clarified what was meant by absolute monarchy, the notion was that government did what government wanted to do. The person of the monarch and his position was secured by providence, by God. And there was really no greater crime than to not obey the monarch, to be a revolutionary. This is why Ben Franklin in Congress said, "We must all hang together, else we shall all hang separately," because King George III of Great Britain's model was much more along the lines of Louis XIV's model. Indeed, much of the indictment that our forefathers had of the abuses under King George III stemmed from the fact that he was not honoring the principles of self-government articulated in the Magna Carta of 1215. Prudence, indeed, will dictate the government's long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. This was to differentiate also this revolution with what would come in France, in that the reason for the revolution has to be sound. They're not recommending to overthrow government just because, there are aspects of it which you don't like. Rather, things have to come to a head. It has to be clear that government is despotic. It's a tyranny. And that's when you need to rise up and throw off that government. These were men who were steeped in the writings of the Enlightenment as well as classical history. And of course, one of the great fissures that runs through classical history is what happened in Rome with the advent of the Caesars. and how, for all the ills of the Roman system, under the Republic, under the Roman Senate, at least the worst excesses of the Roman emperors were avoided. So when a dictator rises up, you need to do something about it, lest you lose your God-given freedom forever. And they point out that the colonies haven't been very patient in only coming to this resolve as late as they have. In the run-up to this, you have to understand that the relationship with England had been souring for quite some time, at least since the French and Indian War, some 10 or 12 years earlier. There had been a series of clashes between the colonists and representatives from the mother country over that time. And as promised, they are putting forth their legal case for this separation to the candid world. Let's get back to the document. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. Okay, so these first three, they're saying, part of the job of the King of England is to authorize laws when Parliament is in session. And back in these days, the custom was not for a perpetual Parliament. Generally, Parliament took their seats, when needed. The system was evolving towards more of a standing legislative body. But the prior precedent had really been the Parliament sat only when the king called for them to. And generally, the king called for him to when he needed money. And in this particular period, the king needed a lot of money, given the global responsibilities of the empire, the constant warfare, and the need to handle administration for widespread colonies. He wound up relying on Parliament more and more. But this led to a conflict where there was a lot of laws being passed by Parliament that the king didn't agree with. And so he would, in effect, pocket veto many of these laws, thereby kind of breaking the compact. The deal was, hey, we'll pass the stuff to get you the money you need, but in return, there are things we want in terms of lightening the burden of government upon the citizenry. And we need you to approve those. That's been the case between the people and the English monarch, going all the way back, as I mentioned earlier, to Magna Carta in 1215. When he says that he will only pass certain laws for the colonies if they would give up their right to representation, this kind of hits to the heart of the argument. What our founding fathers had pointed out was the deal between the monarch and the people means that, hey, we have some right to redress for our grievances in return for the taxes that we're giving you. If you're going to tax us, therefore, we should be represented in the body of government where we can put forth those grievances and suggest resolution to them. And he absolutely refused to do this because they were colonists. And as far as he was concerned, they had no right to representation in Parliament being colonists. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining, in the meantime, exposed to all dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. Okay, so basically they're saying he played dirty with Parliament, so that even to the extent that the voice of the people was heard within government, uh, he attempted to mute that voice. And in doing so, he opened them up to the potential for foreign invasion or for internal revolution. And this is very true. If the voice of the people is not being heard by the government, it engenders enemies to that government. Often in the cases of these absolute monarchs who arrived at their office through the concept of primogeniture, which meant that their eldest son would generally inherit their title, their government. What would happen is people would become discontented with their current monarch, and so they would start looking for a brother, or in some cases a cast-off son, who had some semblance of legitimacy to that position in the eyes of the people and in the eyes of God, presumably. And so then they would start supporting that person who was often, for his own safety, in exile in a foreign land. And so what would happen is their credibility would grow as a potential ruler for that people. A foreign power would support them and then seek an opportunity where they could land them on their shores with an army and take over the country. It was a very destabilizing event that happened numerous times throughout British history. In fact, when we talk about the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, that's pretty much what they did. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. So what they're saying there is, of course, the colonies contained a vast amount of lands that were being settled, but they were always looking westward. And they were being prevented, for political reasons by the monarch, from settling westward. Mainly because France, and to a lesser extent Spain, owned those territories. Also, they had a concern about the amount of foreigners, non-Englishmen, being allowed to settle in the colonies. So there was this constant battle between them and the king on the subject of the size of their states and who got to settle them. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. This effectively blocked the colonists from access to the courts. So they couldn't access Parliament, and they really couldn't access the royal courts. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. So, corruption of the judicial system. Can't get a fair shake in court. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. Okay, so this has been when you hear reports of tar and feathering, very often that was the way that the colonists would object to their governors. So he would send out someone to be a governor or perhaps a customs official to tax and otherwise harass the colonists. And they would respond by taking a boiling pot of pine tar. Pine tar doesn't get as hot as the coal tar that we're kind of used to, so it wouldn't generally cause serious injuries. They would pick up the official, drag him over to the barrel, dump him in, and then cover him with feathers, making him into a chicken. And that was a way that they would generally respond. They also had riots. They would break glass at the home of that officer. Sometimes they would burn them down. Very rarely would they actually physically harm or kill these officials. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. This was a big deal. The British redcoats stationed in the United States of America, they didn't have barracks. They didn't have camps as a general rule. What they would do is they would find houses in the town that they were effectively policing, and they would just take over part of the house. This led to a lot of clashes. It led, as you can imagine, to cases of rape and assault. And it was really an offensive imposition. Can you imagine someone coming up to you today from, say, France and demanding that you put 2 of their soldiers in your master bedroom and you go find another place to sleep? It's ridiculous. But this is what they did. He is affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He is combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. So some big offenses really listed here. Basically, he allowed the military to run roughshod over the colonists. And he also, when they sought redress through the courts, he didn't honor their own courts, but rather insisted that these matters be conducted in England, which didn't hardly give them a fair shake. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. So you can see there, kind of more detail on what was happening economically and legally. Basically, the business of America was business even back then, and what the crown was trying to do was to extract money from the colonies to pay for the expense of upkeep in those colonies, and particularly for the French and Indian War. So as relations worsened, and as the colonists resisted these attempts, a great example was the Boston Tea Party, where a tax on tea, which was the drink of choice in the colonies at that point, led to a bunch of colonists dressing up as Native Americans, attacking a ship laden with tea and dumping that tea into the harbor, thereby destroying the opportunity that the British had for selling that tea and getting the revenue from it. So these kind of things were at the root of how Boston, in particular, responded to the monarch, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burned our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. So there's a lot there. Basically, they're saying, hey, the situation has gotten to the point where he is using violence against his people. You claim that we are Englishmen, and yet you give us none of the rights of Englishmen. You recognize none of them. You tear down our attempts to govern ourselves because back in England, you're completely unresponsive to our petitions for redress anyway. So we erect our own forms of government in these colonies, and then you tear them down and send in an army to ravage us. Moreover, you don't even send in Englishmen for this task, but rather you take German mercenaries, mainly Hessians, and you send them over here to beat us into submission. That's something when we're supposed to be one people. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. This was impressment, which is how the Royal Navy got its sailors, is they would come into a town when they were in port, get you drunk, say pay for it with the king's coin, and then say you belong to us. Or they would capture you in your own vessel, under your own flag, and just kidnap you, put you on their ship, sometimes even steal your ship. This was also a practice which led to the War of 1812, after the Revolutionary War. He has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. A lot of these colonies, they would have intermittent wars with their Native American tribes, particularly to their west. And the fact that from time to time the King of England would treat with these tribes against the interests of the colonists was a particularly odious affair, which is why you see it here listed last. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people, nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They, too, have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. So in other words, they're saying this isn't just about the monarch. The fact is that in obeying their monarch, the British people have likewise sundered the relationship with their American brethren. And they're recognizing that, look, there's no relationship here. So we will treat you as we treat the rest of mankind, the French, the Danes, whomever. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, followed by 56 signatures. Wow. So you can see there in their summary that what they're essentially saying is, look, we've explained to you the reason why we have sundered the relationship between ourselves and the British people and its government. God will judge us as to whether our intentions are good here. But we are free and independent states. That means each of those 13 colonies is its own state. It's no longer a colony. It's no longer a appendage of the British Empire. It is its own state. And it's asserting the right to self-government. Okay, so the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, do all other things independent states may of right do. Lots of rights language here in this document, as you might expect. What they're essentially saying is look, the King of England has failed as a ruler of these colonies. He's basically lost his right to require obedience of us. He doesn't listen to our petitions for redress. He doesn't give us access to the courts, doesn't give us access to the legislature. He conspires against us with foreign powers and with the barbarians, as they would put it, to their west. He sends in his armed forces periodically, replete with foreign mercenaries, in order to cudgel us into submission. He sends us officials whose only purpose is to extract, at great cost, money from our pockets and to destroy our livelihoods. So you can see in this document many of what I would describe as American values. One is, despite the fact that many of these founding fathers were deists, they were people who believed basically that while God created the universe, he took no part in it after that creation. He basically wound it up and let it go. Yet they still had kind of a vestigial Christianity, which led them to seek the favor of God in these kind of proceedings, these very serious affairs. But they believed that rights came from God, that all men were created equal. Of course, all men created equal would come up over the next century, because the colonists at the time had a significant population of slaves. During the slave trade, 306,000 Africans were brought over to be made slaves. And so that was a significant population. Of course, over time it grew as they had families. But the issue that many of the founding fathers put forth with regard to that was that they were not men, and therefore they were not part of that notion that all men are created equal. People get this confused with the Great Compromise during the debate on the Constitution, where they agreed, for purpose of apportionment, the number of House seats that you would get, they agreed that they would count slaves as 3/5 for that purpose. That wasn't saying that a slave was 3/5 of a person. What they were saying is it's not right for you to count in the southern states people you hold in bondage to strengthen the amount of people you have voting in the House of Representatives. They were trying to prevent the dominance of the House of Representatives by slaveholding states, which would then, of course, use that dominance to ensure that slavery continued within the colonies, within the United States. So a different matter there altogether, but part of the same discussion is you have one part of the leaders of these colonies viewing slaves as inhuman, as simply property. You have another portion viewing slaves as human beings. And that great battle would continue to be fought until the end of the Civil War. Some people might argue it went on beyond that even. But that doesn't undermine the truth of that value that all men are created equal, nor does it undermine their commitment to it. They were wrong about slaves not being men, clearly. But you could hold that all men are created equal, a fairly radical notion for the time, and simultaneously hold that slaves are not equal because slaves are not men. While it's in error, logically, it is still a sound conclusion. Let me be very careful to restate that. Although they are wrong, that it is a grievous injustice to make any man a slave, whether under the form of plantation slavery or indentured servitude, which was how many people got to the colonies in the first place. You could still make the logical case that when I say all men are created equal, I am not counting slaves as men. They are property. Wrong, but logically consistent. And it would take a century or so until just how wrong they were was revealed, not least of which because of the efforts of Christians to constantly question the notion that slaves weren't people. They rather obviously were, at least obvious to us. So all men being created equal, very radical notion, very deeply held value. The notion that government ought to be responsible to the people, and that the purpose of government, the reason why government exists, is to secure the rights of the people. This is the concept of ordered liberty. This is the notion that, hey, in a state of Hobbesian nature, Thomas Hobbes, the great philosopher earlier in the period, in a state of Hobbesian nature where there is no government, those rights do not really exist because the only right is the right of the strong to crush the weak. So we need government in order to protect the weak from the strong, because the weak have rights too, all men being equal. You can see there the patriotism that they valued. It was deeply offensive to them that the King of England would sometimes side with Native Americans. They were not citizens. They were not Englishmen. And even with foreigners, even sending foreigners to crack skulls on the colonists. You can see how much they value equality under the law. They were excluded from the courts. They were excluded from the legislatures. And that offended them deeply. You can see the value that they place on self-sufficiency, on self-reliance. They wanted to govern themselves, not have a remote government, from England. They didn't see themselves as being subordinate to the rulers of England. They wanted to govern their own affairs, set their own laws, defend themselves. That's what they wanted to do. So when we look at these kind of values, this kind of love for justice and fairness that is so evident when you read this document, this respect for tradition. They talk about how this is hard because this kind of revolutionary behavior is not really in their DNA. They've been brought to this point simply by the excess outrages of their rulers. Otherwise, they were perfectly happy if they had been granted representation in Parliament, if the king had actually appeared to listen to them, if some of these terrible offenses were dealt with in a more just way, they wouldn't be rebelling. So hopefully on this Independence Day, as we consider the history of this great nation, and as we look deeper into the values that have made this nation great, I hope that this recourse to the document which really started it all will prove useful. Because at the end of the day, history is one thing, but culture is everything. Thank you. Have a wonderful 4th of July, and talk to you soon.